In the last project of Chapter 5, we're going to take a look at some of the auditing tools that Excel has to offer. And we're going to see buttons within the Formula Auditing group that allow us to view relationships between cells and formulas. It'll also allow us to check formulas for accuracy within a formula. And this is especially helpful when you look at a worksheet or a workbook that's been created by someone else, and it's kind of hard sometimes to understand some of the relationships between the formulas and other data within a workbook. And so using some of these auditing tools will help us look at those relationships and even maybe determine if there are errors between some of the data within the workbook. We're first going to take a look at the trace precedence and trace dependence arrows, and if you'd like you can read in the few paragraphs that are in the middle of page 166 before we start Project 5A. I am going to use the current workbook that we were in previously to look at the trace precedence and trace dependence features and buttons. And we're going to look at, we've looked at this formula before in cell B8. Notice it's the sum function that uses cells B4, B5, 6, and 7 in its formula. And this is pretty simplistic, but you can find what cells are being used within that formula by using the trace precedence button. And so again, on the formulas tab in the formula auditing group, we're going to look at trace precedence, and you can see the line, kind of the blue arrow draws through those cells that provide the information or the data to that function. And I know that seems pretty simplistic, we can see that there, but in real life you may have a function in a cell that houses information from a variety of cells that aren't necessarily located around columns A, B, C, D, and F. They may be over in other areas of Excel, and so using the trace precedence button is helpful in knowing where that information is coming from. To remove those arrows, you can just click on Remove Arrow. And we're going to take a look also at the trace precedence arrow. I'm going to go down to cell B14 in just a minute here. And before we look at the trace dependence arrow, I want us to look at the trace precedence arrow again. And if you notice, this particular formula counts on cells B12 and B13, but now if we click on trace precedence again, that information, the cost per unit, is also counting on total cost. I don't think there will be any others here. I'm going to stay on that. Yeah, the trace precedence will go up because of the sum function containing the 3 cells that are included to get that total. But you can see the pattern, the paths that are followed there, and how each one of those cells are kind of dependent on one another. You can also, if we click on trace dependence, notice that particular E5 is referenced back to B14. So that cell is dependent on cell E5. So it's just a great tool to allow you to follow paths as to where the information is coming from and where it's going to. And again, I'm just going to remove the arrows from that area. Next, we're going to take a look at how we can use the Trace Error button to help us troubleshoot formulas, especially those formulas that have errors in them. And you've probably seen some of the errors that appear if you've used Excel very extensively. I know you've used it obviously in this particular class, but you'll find once you use it more and more that there will be times when you'll have errors appear in your formulas or functions. And some of the examples that they give at the bottom of page 167, some of the errors may be value, it could say name, a variety of other errors that could appear in a cell. But your Trace Error button will allow you to kind of filter through some of those problems and give you some ideas of how you can fix those problems. And if you look on page 168, you have an NA as an error code, a name and value. Table 5.1 kind of describes to you what is the problem, typically within a cell that has that particular error code. So in 5B, we're going to take a look at a different workbook that allows us to kind of practice this. And if you'll notice, there are quite a few cells that have green triangles in the upper left-hand corner. That's an indicator to the person viewing the worksheet that there's a problem with that cell. And if you go to that cell, click in the cell, you'll get the Trace Error button to appear. If you lay your mouse on that trace error button, it'll tell you the formula contains unrecognized text. And so we can go through and kind of read through those and try to troubleshoot through those one by one. And that's what Project 5B does for us. It asks us to pull up this workbook, Precision Sales Target. It asks us to save it as Excel Level 2, Chapter 5, Project 5, which I haven't done. But we're going to go through initially solving these one by one. And actually, when you solve one cell, it may fix another cell, depending on how dependent they are. But they asked us to first go to cell E4, and you'll notice the formula is C4 plus C4 times West. And if we click on the trace error button, it says the value is not available to the formula or the function. Okay? Now, if we look in there, it's referencing a named cell, right? West. Okay? Now, we're going to use the tracer arrows to locate the source of that named cell. So, if you go up to the error checking button on the ribbon, click on the drop down arrow there, there's an option for trace error. Click on that. Now notice it's jumping to a cell K5, which is referred to West. If we had just named that cell, it would probably make sense and the formula would come through there. So to name a cell, obviously need to be in cell K5, and then to name it, oh, it's named West, but there's nothing in there. Okay, that makes sense. So if we put a value in, if you'll notice on page 169, letter E, 3E, they tell us that they want that to be at 1.25%. As soon as we put that in there, notice that corrects E4. Okay, so now it has something to refer to. Okay. Alright, let's look at cell D4. Kind of the same formula here, C4 plus C4 times East. Now East does have something in there, but let's see what happens here if we trace the error. Okay, it goes back. The formula contains unrecognized text. Okay, let me clear the arrows for just a second, and then let's trace error again. Okay, so it's saying it's not recognizing any text. Alright, so let's see. It's going to cell C4, which is okay, and then to East. I don't know if it'll go back to East or not. Okay, so East has a number in it, but let's go to the name box. There is no East in there. Okay, so let's name that. Let's come back over to K4 and name East, and that corrects the error. Okay, now let's drop down to D5, see what its error message is. A value used in the formula is of the wrong data type. So C5, we know East is right. What's going on in C5? Okay, I don't know if you can tell this or not, but it doesn't have it's got a space in there. Spaces don't work in calculations. So that should be 2.14. And again, by making that one change, that corrected many of the areas down at the bottom. What some of these other ones are. C12 plus, those I think are all okay now that we've corrected them. Some D12, those are all okay as well. Another error that can sometimes occur or happen is with data validation. And if you look in the middle of page 170, it refers to circling of invalid data. In other words, if data validation rules have been applied after numbers have already been entered into a range of cells, those particular those existing values have not been tested against the new rules. So let's assume that these numbers were put in yesterday. Okay, and today someone has gone in and applied a data validation. Now let's see what the data validation is. Alright, allow decimal greater than or equal to 1.57. So anything under 1.57 should be flagged. Like that's not greater than 1.57. And there's a couple that aren't. But anyway, to have the computer go through and check that, you can select that range of cells, and then once that range of cells has been selected that you want to check, you can go under your data tab, choose data validation, and circle invalid data. And after circling the invalid data, you can see the red circles around each one of those cells that do not meet that data validation. Now, those numbers have a direct effect on the total, because each one of these, if you look at the end, the total here, there's a sum function that totals these amounts for the base, east, west, north, and south, and then there's also a total in H22. Now, they're going to demonstrate, and I know this is not really, well, if I change these numbers, it automatically changes the overall total amount, and let's just assume that that total amount is in H100, and you kind of want to watch that particular cell as these numbers change, and any of these numbers, if they make a change, you kind of want to see how it affects the overall total. What you can do is use a feature called the watch window that will allow you to pull that cell, and you can have several cells, several cells within a watch window, where you're kind of watching how the overall amounts are being affected when you change some of these input cells. Anyway, the watch window allows you to pull a window so you can see it at all times. And to do that, we're going to go back to the Formulas tab, and in the Formula Auditing group, you'll see Watch Window. And we're going to add a watch. I'm already in H22, but if you weren't, you would have to move to that and click in it. And then I'm going to click Add. Okay, now I'm going to move this window a little bit so that it's not taking up an entire screen there, if I can do that. Trying to get the four-sided arrow. Okay, so the watch window, well, okay, there's the watch window. Now, as we go through and change these numbers, okay, I can't really see H22, but I can have it in the watch window. And again, just kind of pretend here a little bit that that's over in A100, and that's a long way down. So we can see it though immediately what's happening. This is the value in that cell right now. If we go through and make some changes to these cells that obviously don't meet the data validation, they have us typing in 1.58, and I'm getting this number from the bottom of page 171, and then C13 1.61 and C16 1.57. Notice these numbers are changing as I enter those in. So it's a great tool. This watch window is a great tool to use if you've got cells throughout your worksheet that you're not able to see, but you need to be using as a tracker to kind of see what these variable cells, as they're being changed, how that affects the overall changes and probably important cells at one time. So that concludes chapter 5. The concepts check is on page 174, top of page 175. Make sure you go through the assessments at the end of the chapter. There's some great exercises for each one of these tools. Make sure also, even though the assessments may be pretty simplistic, make sure you understand the concepts themselves. And really, you know, I'm thinking of the 1 variable and 2 variable data tables, the scenario manager. Those were set up for us pretty nicely, but just make sure that you can do some of that from scratch as well. So, and as always, if you have questions, feel free to email me or call me.